The people who change your life forever rarely announce themselves before they do it. On a warm Thursday afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia, Danielle Carter drove home along a familiar stretch of road she had traveled hundreds of times before. The sun hung low above the horizon, casting long golden reflections across her windshield as she left Jefferson Elementary School after another exhausting but rewarding day of teaching third graders. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, and a stack of papers waited on the passenger seat beside her, but her attention was fixed on something far more important. Attached to the dashboard was a small photograph that had been there for years. Every time she got behind the wheel, she glanced at it without thinking. In the picture, a smiling man stood beside her in a navy blue dress uniform, one arm around her shoulder, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Marcus Carter had been gone for almost 5 years, yet there were still moments when Danielle expected to hear his voice beside her. She reached out and lightly touched the corner of the photograph while waiting at a red light. "Still keeping an eye on me, aren't you?" she whispered with a tired smile. The light turned green, and traffic rolled forward. It should have been an ordinary drive home. It should have been a forgettable afternoon. But some days begin like every other day before quietly becoming the day people remember forever. Danielle turned onto a two-lane road lined with trees and small businesses. The radio played softly in the background while she thought about lesson plans, weekend errands, and whether she had enough groceries for dinner. Ahead, a police cruiser sat parked near an intersection. She barely noticed it. Moments later, flashing lights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. Danielle blinked in surprise and checked her speed. She was not speeding. She looked around, wondering if the officer intended to pass her, but the lights remained directly behind her vehicle. Following procedure, she slowed down and carefully pulled onto the shoulder. Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from confusion. She lowered her window, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Cars continued passing by as the officer stepped out of the cruiser and approached. Danielle took a slow breath and reminded herself that it would probably be a simple misunderstanding. She had no idea that this routine stop would soon attract attention far beyond her small community. She had no idea that names long forgotten by the public would be spoken again. Most of all, she had no idea that by the following morning, people from across the country would be watching a story that began with nothing more than flashing lights in a rearview mirror and a photograph resting quietly on a dashboard. Officer Ryan Mitchell stopped beside Danielle's driver's side window and adjusted his sunglasses before looking inside the vehicle. Danielle kept both hands visible on the steering wheel exactly as she had been taught years earlier. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said in a tone that sounded more impatient than friendly. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Danielle politely shook her head. "No, sir, I do not." Mitchell glanced around the interior of the car before looking back at her. "Your turn signal timing looked questionable back there." Danielle blinked. She was surprised but remained calm. "I am sorry if I made a mistake. I was not aware of it." Instead of immediately asking for identification and moving on, Mitchell continued studying her. Something about the interaction felt uncomfortable. Danielle had experienced enough difficult moments in life to recognize when a conversation was becoming something more than a routine exchange. Still, she remained respectful. Mitchell requested her driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Danielle carefully explained where each document was located before reaching for them. She handed everything over without hesitation. Mitchell examined the documents longer than necessary and then looked toward the photograph on the dashboard. "Who is that?" he asked. Danielle turned briefly toward the picture and smiled softly. "My husband." Mitchell nodded. "Military." Danielle's smile became smaller but warmer. "Yes, he served for many years." Mitchell did not ask anything further. He returned to his cruiser with the documents while Danielle waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Traffic continued flowing beside the shoulder while Danielle sat quietly. Several drivers slowed as they passed, curious about the stop. Danielle checked the clock. She had hoped to be home by now. Another 5 minutes passed. Eventually, Mitchell stepped out again, carrying a small notepad. His expression looked noticeably more serious than before. Danielle felt her stomach tighten. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked when he approached. Instead of answering directly, Mitchell began asking additional questions. Where was she coming from? Where was she going? Did she own the vehicle? Had she been stopped before? Danielle answered each question calmly and honestly. Yet the conversation seemed to create more suspicion instead of less. A few passing motorists began noticing the unusually long stop. One woman parked briefly in a nearby lot and watched from a distance. Danielle remained composed, but inside she could feel growing confusion. Nothing about the situation made sense. She had provided every document requested. She had followed every instruction. She had remained respectful throughout the encounter. Yet the atmosphere continued becoming more tense. Back at the elementary school, parents were picking up children and beginning their evening routines. Across town, people were grocery shopping, heading home from work, or preparing dinner. None of them knew that a routine traffic stop on a quiet roadside was slowly turning into something that would soon attract public attention. Danielle glanced once more at Marcus's photograph. Looking at his familiar smile always helped steady her nerves. For a brief moment, she felt calmer. Then she noticed another patrol vehicle pulling onto the shoulder behind Mitchell's cruiser. Whatever was happening, it was clearly no longer about a turn signal. The arrival of the second patrol car changed the atmosphere immediately. Danielle watched through her side mirror as another officer stepped out and exchanged a few quiet words with Officer Mitchell. Neither man approached her vehicle for several minutes. Instead, they stood beside the cruisers, occasionally glancing in her direction while discussing something she could not hear. The longer the delay continued, the more unusual the situation became. Danielle checked the time again. Nearly 30 minutes had passed since the stop began. She thought about calling the school to explain why she would be late returning some materials, but she decided to wait. She did not want to do anything that might be misunderstood. Finally, Officer Mitchell returned to her window. His expression remained serious. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle for a moment." Danielle looked surprised. "May I ask why?" Mitchell paused. "We are conducting additional verification." The explanation made little sense, but Danielle complied. She slowly exited the vehicle and stood beside the shoulder as instructed. The afternoon heat was beginning to fade, and a light breeze moved through the trees nearby. Cars continued passing, though many drivers noticeably slowed as they observed the unusual scene. Danielle remained calm. Years of teaching children had taught her patience under pressure. "Officer, is there a specific issue that needs to be resolved?" she asked politely. Mitchell avoided giving a direct answer. Instead, he asked another series of questions. The exchange continued in circles. Every answer Danielle provided seemed to lead to another question. The situation felt less like a routine stop and more like an attempt to justify keeping her there. Meanwhile, several people had begun recording from a distance with their phones. One local business owner standing outside a nearby convenience store later said that the entire encounter appeared strange because Danielle remained cooperative the entire time. Another witness would later describe her as calm, respectful, and visibly confused. Yet at that moment, nobody knew how important those observations would become. Eventually, a supervisor was requested. Danielle overheard part of the radio communication and immediately realized the matter had escalated far beyond a traffic concern. Her heart sank, not because she feared she had done something wrong, but because she sensed that facts were no longer driving the situation. Assumptions were. As the minutes passed, frustration slowly spread among the growing number of onlookers. People could see the stop continuing without any obvious explanation. Some quietly questioned why such an ordinary encounter required multiple officers and a supervisor. Danielle did her best to remain composed. She thought about Marcus and something he often said during difficult moments. "Stay steady. Facts have a way of catching up with emotions." She repeated those words silently in her mind. She had no way of knowing that several recordings were already circulating online. She had no way of knowing that local residents were beginning to discuss the encounter across social media platforms. Most importantly, she had no way of knowing that before the sun set that evening, people far beyond Norfolk would begin asking a simple question. Why had a routine traffic stop turned into something that nobody could clearly explain? By early evening, the traffic stop had finally ended, but the questions surrounding it were only beginning. Danielle returned home emotionally drained and deeply unsettled. She sat quietly at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had long since cooled. Friends from the school district had already started calling. Several parents had seen videos circulating online. A local reporter had reached out requesting comment. Danielle politely declined every interview. She did not want attention. She wanted answers. Across Norfolk, however, the story was growing faster than anyone expected. Short video clips recorded by bystanders continued spreading across social media. None of them showed Danielle acting aggressively. None of them showed her refusing instructions. Instead, viewers saw a woman standing calmly beside a road while multiple officers remained focused on her for reasons that were not immediately clear. As the videos gained traction, witnesses began sharing their own accounts. The owner of the nearby convenience store spoke to a local news station. He explained that he had watched much of the encounter from outside his business. According to him, Danielle appeared respectful the entire time. Another witness, a retired nurse who had been driving home from work, described the scene similarly. She remembered feeling uncomfortable because the situation seemed to continue long after any ordinary traffic matter should have been resolved. By 9 o'clock that night, local news outlets were collecting statements and comparing timelines. The public response was immediate. People wanted transparency. They wanted facts. Most importantly, they wanted to understand why a routine stop had drawn so much attention. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Mitchell completed paperwork and spoke with department supervisors. Inside official channels, there was confidence that the situation would eventually fade from public discussion. Similar controversies had appeared before and disappeared within a few news cycles. At least that was the assumption. What nobody realized was that a much larger story was quietly waiting beneath the surface. Back at home, Danielle received a visit from her longtime friend Lisa Reynolds, another teacher from Jefferson Elementary. Lisa arrived carrying takeout food and concern written across her face. The two women sat together for nearly an hour discussing the events of the afternoon. At one point, Lisa looked toward the framed photographs displayed across Danielle's living room. Most of them featured Marcus. Some showed him in uniform. Others captured family vacations, birthdays, and ordinary moments. One photograph in particular always drew attention. It showed Marcus standing beside a group of men whose faces reflected years of discipline, sacrifice, and trust. Visitors often asked about that photograph. Danielle rarely volunteered details. She preferred remembering Marcus as her husband rather than as the accomplished man others knew. As the evening continued, messages began arriving from people Danielle had not spoken to in years. Former neighbors, military families, old friends. Some had seen the videos online. Others had heard about the incident through personal networks. One message simply read, "Are you okay? Please call when you can." Another said, "If Marcus were here, he would be proud of how you handled yourself." Danielle read each message quietly. She had no idea that somewhere else, several people who had once served alongside Marcus Carter were also watching those same videos. And for the first time in years, his name was beginning to move through circles that never forgot one of their own. Shortly after midnight, Danielle finally turned off her phone and attempted to get some sleep, but rest refused to come. The events of the day replayed endlessly in her mind. Every question, every delay, every confused glance from passing drivers. Around 1 in the morning, she walked into the living room and stood in front of the photograph wall once again. The house was silent except for the ticking of an old clock Marcus had purchased years earlier during a deployment overseas. Danielle paused in front of the photograph that always seemed to capture him best. Marcus stood beside several teammates, all smiling despite the obvious exhaustion on their faces. It was one of the few pictures he had ever agreed to frame. He had never enjoyed talking about his accomplishments. In fact, most people in Norfolk knew him simply as Danielle's husband, the friendly neighbor who helped elderly residents carry groceries and volunteered at community events whenever he was home. Very few people understood the level of respect he commanded among those who had served beside him. Danielle gently touched the edge of the frame and smiled. "You always manage to bring people together," she whispered. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a retired commander named Ethan Brooks sat in his home office reviewing messages that had arrived throughout the evening. Ethan had spent years serving alongside Marcus. They had shared difficult assignments, long deployments, and moments that created bonds few civilians could fully understand. One message contained a link to a local news story from Virginia. Another included a short video clip recorded by a witness. Ethan clicked the video and watched quietly. When it ended, he replayed it. Then he watched it a third time. Something about the footage immediately caught his attention. Not because of what happened, but because of who appeared in it. He recognized Danielle instantly. Within minutes, he was sending messages to several former teammates. None of the messages contained anger. None contained threats. They simply asked a question. Has anyone seen this? By sunrise, replies began arriving from different states across the country. Some of the men had not spoken in months. Others had not seen each other in years. Yet Marcus Carter's name still carried enormous weight among them. As conversations spread, more people learned what had happened during the traffic stop. Back in Norfolk, reporters continued investigating. One journalist discovered something unusual while researching Danielle's background. A public photograph from a military charity event showed her standing beside Marcus years earlier. The reporter recognized the surname immediately. Additional research followed. Slowly, pieces began connecting. The story was no longer just about a traffic stop. It was becoming a story about a woman known and respected by a remarkable network of people. Later that morning, Danielle woke to dozens of new messages. Most came from friends. Some came from former military families she had not heard from in years. One message stood out from all the others. It came from Ethan Brooks. The message was short. Danielle, I saw the news. You are not alone. Call me when you are ready. Reading those words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. For the first time since the previous afternoon, she felt a small sense of relief. What she did not yet know was that Marcus's old brotherhood was already beginning to move, and once they started paying attention to something, they rarely looked away. Danielle waited until late morning before returning Ethan Brooks's call. The moment she heard his voice, years seemed to disappear. Ethan spoke with the same calm confidence she remembered from countless family gatherings and military charity events. He did not begin by asking about the news coverage. He asked how she was doing. Danielle appreciated that. For nearly 20 minutes, they talked about ordinary things. The school, mutual friends, life after loss. Only then did Ethan carefully bring up the events of the previous day. Danielle explained everything exactly as it had happened. She described the long delay, the repeated questions, the confusion, and the growing crowd of witnesses. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Marcus would be proud of how you handled yourself, he finally said. Those words meant more than Danielle could explain. After the call ended, Ethan sat quietly for several minutes. Then he opened an old storage box he had not touched in years. Inside were photographs, challenge coins, commendations, and handwritten notes collected throughout his military career. Near the bottom rested a framed metal presentation photograph. Marcus stood in the center of the image, surrounded by teammates and commanders. Ethan smiled as memories returned. Marcus had never been the loudest man in a room. He had never chased recognition. Yet somehow everyone trusted him. Young service members sought his advice. Senior leaders respected his judgment. He possessed a rare ability to remain calm during difficult situations while making everyone around him better. That afternoon, Ethan met with several former teammates through a private video conference. Faces appeared from Texas, Florida, California, Virginia, and several other states. Some men had gray hair now. Others had retired into completely different careers. Yet one thing had not changed: the respect they held for Marcus Carter. The conversation quickly shifted from memories to concern for Danielle. Many of them had already watched the witness videos. Several had spoken with people in Norfolk. One participant, a former military attorney named David Mercer, explained that local journalists were beginning to ask questions about Marcus himself. They are trying to understand who Danielle Carter is, David said. Once they learn who Marcus was, this story is going to grow. Ethan nodded. He believed the same thing. Meanwhile, one Norfolk reporter made a discovery that would soon change public perception entirely. While researching Marcus's history, she uncovered records of community service awards, leadership commendations, and numerous charitable efforts he had supported after leaving active service. The deeper she looked, the more remarkable the picture became. Marcus was not remembered simply because of his military accomplishments. He was remembered because of the lives he had touched. By evening, local news stations began airing segments about Danielle's late husband. Interviews appeared with former neighbors, teachers, veterans, and community leaders. Their stories sounded remarkably similar. Marcus had helped people quietly, without expecting anything in return. As millions of viewers learned his name for the first time, Danielle sat alone in her living room watching old home videos. She smiled through tears as Marcus laughed at something behind the camera. What she did not realize was that across the country, dozens of people who had once followed him into difficult situations were making plans to travel to Virginia. Not because anyone had asked them to. Not because they wanted attention. They were coming because loyalty does not disappear when a uniform comes off, and some bonds remain unbroken long after the mission ends. The following morning, Norfolk felt different. News vans were parked near city offices. Reporters continued interviewing witnesses. Online discussions had expanded beyond Virginia, and people from across the country were now debating what had happened during the traffic stop. Yet behind the headlines, a quieter story was unfolding. Throughout the night, former teammates of Marcus Carter had continued communicating. Phone calls led to more phone calls. Messages reached people who had not spoken in years. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. Someone would pause and say, "If Marcus were here, he would show up for her." That simple observation became impossible to ignore. Ethan Brooks spent much of the morning coordinating conversations. He was careful with every word. Nobody was interested in creating a spectacle. Nobody wanted confrontation. What they wanted was clarity. They wanted facts. Most of all, they wanted Danielle to know she was not facing the situation alone. As information continued emerging, independent journalists began comparing witness statements with official timelines. Several details raised questions. Why had the stop lasted so long? Why had additional officers been called? Why did multiple witnesses describe Danielle as cooperative throughout the encounter? Those questions spread rapidly online. Public interest continued growing. Meanwhile, Danielle tried to maintain some sense of normal life. She visited the school briefly to speak with administrators and reassure concerned coworkers. Students had begun asking questions after hearing adults discuss the story. Danielle smiled warmly and told everyone she appreciated their support. Even under pressure, she remained remarkably composed. That composure impressed people who met her. More importantly, it reminded many of Marcus. By midday, another development changed everything. A local television station aired an extended segment about Marcus's life and service. Former neighbors described his generosity. Community leaders discussed his volunteer work. Veterans shared stories about his character. The report concluded with a simple statement from a retired commander. Marcus Carter was the kind of man people followed because they trusted him completely. Those words resonated with viewers nationwide. Suddenly, countless people who had never heard his name before wanted to know more. As public attention intensified, travel plans quietly took shape. Men from different states booked flights. Others began long drives. Some took time away from businesses, families, and retirement schedules. They were not responding to orders. There were no official instructions. They were responding to loyalty. Late that afternoon, Ethan received confirmation that several former teammates would arrive in Virginia before sunrise. Others planned to arrive shortly afterward. Looking at the growing list of names, Ethan felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because Marcus had inspired such enduring respect. Sadness because Marcus was not there to see it. That evening, Danielle received another call from Ethan. This time, his voice carried a hint of emotion. "There are some people coming to town," he said. Danielle sounded confused. "For what?" Ethan smiled quietly. "For you." Danielle did not fully understand what he meant. She assumed a few old friends might stop by. Maybe several veterans would attend a community meeting. Nothing more. After ending the call, she looked once again at the photograph resting on her dashboard, the same photograph that had been with her during the traffic stop. She had spent years believing that Marcus's story belonged mostly to the past. She was about to discover just how wrong she had been. Because while the public focused on news reports and online debates, a brotherhood that rarely drew attention to itself was already moving toward Norfolk, and by the next morning, their presence would become impossible to ignore. Before sunrise, Norfolk remained quiet, but the story was already moving in a new direction. While most residents slept, investigative journalists and independent analysts continued examining every available piece of information from the traffic stop. Several witnesses who had previously remained silent decided to come forward. One by one, they shared their accounts. Although their backgrounds differed, their descriptions sounded remarkably consistent. They described Danielle as calm, cooperative, and respectful throughout the encounter. They described a situation that appeared to grow increasingly complicated without any obvious reason. Those statements quickly attracted attention because they challenged assumptions that had begun circulating online. By early morning, local media outlets were requesting additional public records and reviewing available footage. Questions multiplied. Why had the stop extended so long? Why had multiple officers become involved? Why did witness descriptions differ from some of the early explanations being discussed? As reporters searched for answers, another development quietly changed the conversation. A transportation consultant reviewing publicly available traffic camera footage identified a segment showing portions of the roadside interaction from a distant angle. The footage did not contain dramatic revelations. In fact, its significance came from what it lacked. It showed prolonged discussion, visible cooperation, and an absence of the behavior some people had speculated about online. That discovery encouraged journalists to dig deeper. Throughout the morning, news organizations began comparing timelines from different sources. The more comparisons they made, the more inconsistencies appeared. Public pressure for transparency increased. Meanwhile, Danielle spent the morning answering supportive messages from friends and former military families. She still avoided interviews. She still refused to attack anyone publicly. When reporters requested statements, she repeated the same simple message. I just want the truth. Her restraint impressed many observers. It also made it more difficult for critics to portray her negatively. Across the city, Officer Ryan Mitchell found himself facing growing scrutiny. Questions from supervisors became more detailed. Reporters continued contacting the department. Social media discussions expanded nationally. For the first time since the stop, Mitchell began realizing that the situation was not fading away. It was growing. Yet even then, he still did not fully understand why. He assumed public interest centered entirely on the traffic stop itself. He did not realize that another force was building behind the scenes. Late that morning, Ethan Brooks received a series of text messages confirming arrivals. Former teammates had landed at airports. Others had completed overnight drives. More were still on the way. Ethan reviewed the list quietly. The names represented decades of service, leadership, sacrifice, and friendship. Some of these men had attended Marcus and Danielle's wedding. Others had stood beside Marcus during the most difficult periods of his career. All of them shared one thing in common. They never forgot people who mattered. Around noon, Danielle received another unexpected call. This time it came from a journalist she trusted. The reporter spoke carefully before asking a simple question. Did you know people connected to Marcus are arriving from all over the country? Danielle was stunned. What do you mean? The reporter paused. I mean, this is becoming much bigger than a local story. Danielle looked at the photograph on her desk and slowly shook her head in disbelief. For years, she had viewed Marcus through the lens of family and love. She knew he was respected. She knew people admired him. What she was only beginning to understand was the extraordinary reach of that respect. And by the time the next sunrise arrived, the entire country would begin to understand it as well. The next morning began with an unusual sense of anticipation spreading across Norfolk. Reporters arrived earlier than usual. Local residents checked their phones before leaving for work. Coffee shops buzzed with quiet conversations about the story that had dominated local headlines for days. Yet the most remarkable developments were taking place away from cameras. Just after sunrise, vehicles began arriving from different directions. Some came from nearby states. Others had traveled hundreds of miles through the night. There was nothing flashy about them. No sirens. No public announcements. Just ordinary vehicles carrying extraordinary people. Ethan Brooks stood in the parking lot of a modest veterans community center as the arrivals continued. One by one, old friends stepped out. Some embraced without speaking. Others exchanged handshakes and brief smiles. Many had not seen each other for years, but the connection between them remained immediate. They shared memories, stories, and a common purpose. As the group grew larger, local residents began noticing. A reporter driving past the community center slowed down after recognizing several well-known veterans from previous military events. Another journalist received a tip that something unusual was happening. Within an hour, speculation started spreading online. Why were so many respected veterans gathering in Norfolk at the same time? Meanwhile, Danielle remained completely unaware of the scale of what was unfolding. She spent the morning answering messages from concerned parents and friends. Several colleagues stopped by with food and words of encouragement. Everyone seemed eager to support her. What surprised Danielle most was how many people mentioned Marcus. Some shared stories she had never heard before. Others described small acts of kindness he had performed years earlier and never mentioned at home. Each story revealed another piece of the man she loved. Around mid-morning, a local television station aired a segment showing footage from outside the Veterans Center. The reporter noted that numerous former military personnel had arrived from across the country. The segment stopped short of drawing conclusions, but viewers immediately connected the timing to the growing public controversy. Social media erupted with new questions. Public curiosity intensified. Back at the center, Ethan gathered everyone together. He spoke briefly and directly. "We are here for Danielle. We are here for truth. We are here because Marcus would have done the same for any one of us." Heads nodded throughout the room. No speeches followed. No dramatic declarations. The statement was enough. Shortly afterward, the group began making plans to attend upcoming public meetings and community discussions related to the ongoing investigation. Their goal was simple. They wanted transparency. They wanted accountability. They wanted facts. As word continued spreading, local officials became increasingly aware that the situation had attracted national attention. What had started as a routine roadside encounter was now being examined by journalists, community leaders, veterans organizations, and ordinary citizens from across America. By early afternoon, Danielle finally received a call from Ethan asking if they could meet later that day. She agreed without hesitation. Yet as she drove toward the meeting location, she noticed something strange. People seemed to recognize her. Some waved. Others offered encouraging smiles. A few even thanked her for her grace under pressure. Danielle felt overwhelmed. She had never sought public attention. She had only wanted answers. What she did not yet know was that the gathering taking shape around Marcus's memory was about to become visible to everyone. And once it did, the entire story would enter a completely different chapter. When Danielle arrived at the Veterans Community Center that afternoon, she expected to see a handful of familiar faces. Instead, she stopped walking the moment she entered the parking lot. Vehicles filled nearly every available space. Men and women stood in small groups talking quietly. Some wore business suits. Others wore simple jeans and jackets. A few carried themselves with the unmistakable posture of people who had spent years serving something larger than themselves. Danielle immediately recognized several faces. Then several more. And then several more after that. For a moment, she could not speak. Ethan Brooks noticed her arrival and walked over with a warm smile. "I told you that you were not alone," he said. Danielle looked around in disbelief. "How many people are here?" Ethan laughed softly. "More than I expected." As they entered the building, conversations gradually stopped. One by one, people turned toward Danielle. There was no applause, no dramatic display, just quiet respect. Many of them had not seen her in years. Yet every person in that room knew exactly who she was. More importantly, every person in that room remembered Marcus. Throughout the afternoon, Danielle listened to stories she had never heard before. One man described how Marcus had helped him through a difficult period after leaving military service. Another spoke about a young service member whose career had been saved because Marcus took time to mentor him. A third recalled a deployment during which Marcus volunteered for an assignment nobody wanted. The stories came from different years, different locations, and different circumstances, yet they all revealed the same pattern. Marcus had consistently placed other people before himself. Danielle felt both pride and heartbreak as she listened. Meanwhile, outside the center, reporters continued gathering. News crews noticed the growing number of arrivals. Social media users posted photographs. Online speculation exploded. National news outlets began paying attention. One headline described the gathering as an extraordinary show of loyalty. Another called it a testament to the lasting impact of character and service. By early evening, journalists estimated that nearly 30 former members of elite military units and leadership circles connected to Marcus had traveled to Norfolk. The number quickly became a major talking point across television and online media. People wanted to know why so many highly respected individuals had come together. The answer was surprisingly simple. They had come because they believed Danielle deserved support and because Marcus had spent a lifetime earning their trust. Across town, Officer Ryan Mitchell watched portions of the news coverage with growing concern. For the first time, he saw the scale of attention surrounding the story. What unsettled him most was not the criticism. It was the realization that the situation involved people and relationships he had never understood. This was no longer a local controversy. It had become a national conversation about fairness, accountability, and respect. Back at the community center, the gathering eventually moved outdoors as the sun began setting. Nearly 30 individuals stood together for a group photograph requested by a local reporter. There were no speeches, no protests, no threats, just a quiet line of people united by loyalty to a man they respected and concern for a woman they cared about. When the photograph appeared online later that evening, it spread across the country within hours. Millions of people saw it. And for the first time, the public began asking not what had happened during a traffic stop, but who Marcus Carter had been to inspire such extraordinary devotion years after his passing. The photograph taken outside the Veterans Community Center became one of the most shared images of the week. News organizations across the country featured it in articles and broadcasts. Commentators discussed the unusual gathering. Viewers who had never heard of Marcus Carter suddenly wanted to know everything about him. The question appeared everywhere. Who was this man whose memory could bring together so many respected people years after his death? Over the next 24 hours, the answer began emerging piece by piece. Journalists interviewed former teammates, community leaders, neighbors, and military families. Each interview added another layer to the story. They learned that Marcus had spent years mentoring young service members. They learned that he had quietly supported veterans struggling to transition into civilian life. They learned that he volunteered at schools, community centers, and charity events without ever seeking recognition. Most remarkably, they learned that many of the people gathering in Norfolk did not consider Marcus a hero because of awards or accomplishments. They considered him a hero because of how he treated people. As these stories spread, public perception shifted dramatically. What had begun as a discussion about one traffic stop was becoming a broader conversation about character, dignity, and accountability. Danielle watched the coverage from home with mixed emotions. Part of her felt proud. Another part felt overwhelmed. For years, she had carried her memories of Marcus privately. Now the entire country seemed to be discovering the man she already knew. Late that afternoon, a major national network aired a special segment dedicated entirely to his life. The host concluded with a simple observation. Perhaps the most powerful measure of a person is not what happens while they are present, but who still shows up after they are gone. Those words resonated deeply with viewers. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Mitchell found himself increasingly isolated from the public narrative he had expected. Instead of focusing on him, attention was centering on Marcus and Danielle. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One story reflected patience, service, and integrity. The other reflected unanswered questions. As pressure mounted, department officials announced that a comprehensive review of the traffic stop would continue and that all available evidence would be examined. The announcement was welcomed by many members of the public. They wanted facts rather than speculation. They wanted transparency rather than assumptions. At the Veterans Center, Ethan Brooks and several former teammates spent the evening sharing stories with local reporters. None of them attacked anyone. None demanded special treatment. They simply spoke honestly about Marcus. One reporter later admitted that she had expected dramatic statements. Instead, she encountered humility, discipline, and quiet loyalty. That unexpected tone made an even stronger impression. By the end of the evening, millions of Americans had heard Marcus Carter's name. Millions had seen the photograph of nearly 30 respected veterans standing together. And millions had begun understanding why they came. They were not gathered because of anger. They were gathered because one man had spent a lifetime earning something far more valuable than attention. He had earned trust. And now, years after his passing, that trust was still moving people to action in ways nobody could have imagined. Several days after the gathering in Norfolk captured national attention, the official review reached a critical stage. Investigators had spent countless hours examining reports, timelines, witness statements, and every available piece of evidence related to the traffic stop. Public interest remained intense, but the conversation had matured. People were no longer driven by rumors. They wanted verified facts. They wanted a process they could trust. Danielle continued teaching whenever possible, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy despite the constant attention. Her students remained her refuge. Inside the classroom, life followed a simpler rhythm. Outside, however, the story continued to unfold. One afternoon, local officials announced that preliminary findings would be released. Reporters gathered. Cameras lined the room. Community leaders attended. Ethan Brooks and several of Marcus's former teammates quietly took seats near the back. Danielle arrived with Lisa Reynolds and sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap. The room fell silent as the review panel began speaking. The findings confirmed what many witnesses had described from the beginning. Danielle had remained cooperative throughout the encounter. Several assumptions made during the stop were not supported by the available evidence. Procedures would be reviewed. Additional training recommendations would be implemented. Internal actions would follow according to department policy. The announcement was measured and professional, but its significance was unmistakable. For Danielle, the most important thing was not punishment. It was acknowledgement. Someone had finally said publicly what she had known all along. The truth mattered. Outside the building, reporters rushed to deliver updates. Within minutes, headlines spread across the country. Yet something unexpected happened. Rather than focusing exclusively on disciplinary outcomes, many news organizations chose to highlight a different story. They focused on Danielle's composure. They focused on Marcus's legacy. They focused on the extraordinary show of support that had emerged from a single act of loyalty. That evening, Ethan and several former teammates gathered with Danielle for dinner at a small local restaurant. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. For the first time since the traffic stop, people laughed freely. Old stories resurfaced. Memories of Marcus filled the room. At one point, Ethan raised a glass of iced tea and smiled. "You know what amazes me?" he said. Marcus spent his whole life avoiding attention, and somehow he still managed to bring everyone together. The table erupted in quiet laughter because everyone knew it was true. Later that night, Danielle returned home and sat alone in her living room. She looked at the familiar photograph wall that had become such a powerful symbol during the previous week. The events surrounding the traffic stop had changed many things, but they had also revealed something beautiful. Marcus's influence had not ended when his life ended. It continued through friendships, through values, through the people he had helped, and through the example he left behind. As Danielle prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with one final message from Ethan. It contained only a single sentence. The truth showed up, just like Marcus always believed it would. Danielle smiled, placed the phone down, and for the first time in many days, felt completely at peace. 1 month later, life in Norfolk had settled into a quieter rhythm. The news trucks were gone. The headlines had moved on. Social media had found new topics to discuss. Yet some stories leave marks that remain long after public attention fades, and this was one of them. On a bright Saturday morning, Danielle drove to a small memorial overlooking the water, a place she and Marcus had visited countless times over the years. The air carried the scent of salt and the distant sound of boats moving across the harbor. In her hands, she carried a simple bouquet of white flowers. There were no cameras waiting for her, no reporters asking questions, no crowds gathered nearby. That was exactly how she wanted it. She walked slowly toward the memorial plaque dedicated to local service members and stopped when she reached Marcus's name. For several moments, she simply stood there in silence. Then she smiled. Not the sad smile of someone trapped in grief, but the peaceful smile of someone who finally understood something important. For years she had believed she was the keeper of Marcus's memory. She now realized she had been wrong. His memory belonged to hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. It lived in former teammates who still carried his lessons. It lived in veterans he had encouraged during difficult seasons of life. It lived in neighbors who remembered his kindness. It lived in students who would never meet him but would hear stories about character, integrity, and service because of him. As Danielle placed the flowers beside the memorial, she remembered the overwhelming week that had changed everything. What began as a moment of confusion and frustration had ultimately revealed something extraordinary. The truth had prevailed. Respect had prevailed. And most surprisingly of all, love had prevailed. Not romantic love alone, but the deeper kind of love expressed through loyalty, friendship, sacrifice, and trust. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "I figured I might find you here." Danielle turned and smiled as Ethan Brooks approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her and stood beside her facing the water. Neither spoke for a while. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually, Ethan glanced toward the memorial and shook his head with a smile. "You know, I still cannot believe how many people showed up." Danielle laughed softly. "Neither can I." Ethan looked out across the harbor. Actually, I can. It was Marcus. Danielle nodded. He was right. The answer had always been simple. People showed up because Marcus had shown up for them. Over and over again. Year after year. Without expecting recognition. Without asking for anything in return. As the morning sun reflected across the water, Danielle felt a sense of closure she had not experienced in a very long time. The difficult days were behind her. The uncertainty was gone. What remained was gratitude. Before leaving, she looked one final time at Marcus's name and quietly whispered, "You are still bringing people together." Then she turned and walked forward into the next chapter of her life, carrying not the weight of the past, but the strength of a legacy that would continue inspiring others for generations to come.